She is Katie Gorka, my muse with the Heritage Foundation. Follow her at Gorka Katie. She does it in the backwards kind of Hungarian Latin way. On Twitter, the article is How the 1960s Riots Foreshadow Today's Communist Weaponization of Black Pain at the Federalist. You can get it at all of our feeds. I'm Sebastian Gorka, back with Katie after this. As former Deputy Assistant to President Donald Trump, I have briefed the President of the United States on critical threats. Let me brief you on a critical threat to your finances. Your savings in the bank or in stocks and bonds are simply entries stored on a very vulnerable electrical grid on a third-party server. What happens if we see banks fail or our electric grid is successfully attacked? There is a way to own profitable investments privately. Do what I did. Discover how Midas Gold Group can bring you financial security today.
Really look at the facts. 93% of protests are non-violent. And in fact, when Trump has put in federal enforcement, out of those 93%, the violence ratchets up, right? And so more than 5% of the protests actually that are linked to the Black Lives Matter movement that was met by force by authorities compared to 1% of other sorts of demonstrations like COVID protests or protests about being unhappy about not being able to, go to the barbershop. Right. And so this is manufactured by the Trump campaign. And I just wish that people understood that and knew that and just looked up the real facts about protests in this country.
It's hard not to conclude that The View is just propaganda. This is Sonny hosting on The View saying that the riots, it's just manufactured. The protests are not violent. And when there is violence, it's actually engendered. It's created by the Trump administration. That's just not the real world. The real world, if you live in places like Portland, if you live in places like Seattle, you understand that violence is real. And the question that so many have asked, including you, our dear listeners, is where is it all coming from? Well, my wife, Katie Gorka, has published a long analysis yesterday in the Federalist about the sources of the violence and also the question of how you weaponize protests. Katie, let's talk about this individual, Eugene Methvin, and why is he so important to answering the question of where does this violence come from?
Well, so there was a similar moment back in the 1960s to what we're going through today. President Eisenhower was supposed to make a state visit to Japan in 1960, and the trip had to be canceled because there were protests, and everybody says these are communists who were protesting. And DeWitt Wallace, who was the legendary editor of the Reader's Digest,
which was an incredibly influential organ back then.
Very powerful, very good quality publication back then. He said, first of all, how do we know they're communists? And second, if they're communists, how do they start a riot? And so he put these two questions on the desk of a young journalist at the time from Georgia.
26-year-old Eugene Methvin. And he studied that question for how long?
10 years. So when he started, there were really no riots going on in the States. It really didn't start up until about 1965. And then, of course, as we all know, the country exploded over the next few years. But it is incredible for today's purposes to go back and read what he found, because the parallels are just profound.
So talk to us about what he found back then in America in the 60s. Talk to us about Students for a Democratic Society and Tom Hayden. And you've read his book, Riot Makers, the seminal book. What did you learn?
So what I learned was two things that I think are particularly important for today. So the first one is everybody concluded, even about the riots in the 60s, that they were spontaneous. What Methvin, in fact, they were called righteous protests. What Methvin discovered, though, and the SDS made no secret about it, Methvin discovered that this group of young, primarily white Marxists called Students for a Democratic Society,
who were linked eventually to the Weather Underground,
part of them became the terrorists, the Weather Underground. They went into 10 cities of the Northeast and spent 3 years in those cities stoking grievances. Now, to be fair, the black populations in those cities had very legitimate grievances, right? Much as today we can say there are reasons to talk about holdovers of racism. Like, we're not saying there's no problems. But what Hayden and his compatriots did was go into these cities and really stoke grievances.
So this was a plan. I mean, they had a plan to exploit grievances into violence.
They were very open about their plan. They talked about their plan. Yep. And not only, here's what's interesting. Not only did they stoke the grievances, they actually provided the tools. So they taught people how to make Molotov cocktails. They instructed people, throw them at white people, throw them at police. They did a lot to raise anger with the police. That was a very big feature. And so when, there was an incident very similar to the George Floyd killing where 2 black men were seen being dragged into a police station in Newark. And that was the explosion that set off days and days of riots. And then, of course, it spread around the country.
Just so people understand, this isn't theorizing. This is documented fact. This individual we're talking about, Tom Hayden, remarkably, was published in the New York Times Review of Books. And in Katie's article, there is a quote from that piece from Tom Hayden in the New York Times Review of Books. The role of organized violence is now being carefully considered. During a riot, for instance, a conscious guerrilla, fascinating language, a conscious guerrilla can participate in pulling police away from the path of people engaged in attacking stores, looting. He can create disorder in new areas the police think are secure. He can carry the torch, if not of all the people, to white neighborhoods and downtown business districts. If necessary, he can successfully shoot to kill. I mean, that could be today, could it not?
You can't tell me that the protesters today, the rioters, are not using that very same playbook. I mean, it's word for word.
Yeah. The article we're talking is about my wife. Is written by my wife, Katie Gorka. It's at The Federalist. You can catch it right now on our Twitter and Facebook feeds. It is entitled, How the 1960s Riots Foreshadow Today's Communist Weaponization of Black Pain. And the most interesting question, is there a connection between the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, from the 1960s and what we are seeing on the streets of America today, and the Black Lives Matter movement? For the answer to that question, stay tuned here on America First, live streaming on YouTube, on Facebook, available on Instagram TV, of course, wherever you get your podcast from. Subscribe today, and don't forget our YouTube channel. Hit the subscription button and then the notifications bell twice, because that's how sneaky they are, and you'll never miss a thing.
America First, magnificent.
Ed Feulner gave us the Heritage Foundation. What an American hero. And now there's an institute, there's a center named after him at Heritage, and Katie Gorka happens to be one of its directors. Follow her right now, Gorka KT on Twitter, and check out her article, How the 1960s Riots Foreshadow Today's Communist Weaponization of Black Pain. We can't go into all the details, but talk about some of the figures, your colleagues and others, who've looked at the organic connections between the SDS of the 1960s and Black Lives Matter today.
Yeah, so very importantly, SDS sort of eventually split, and it developed a militant wing called the Weather Underground. And there are people today from the Weather Underground who are tied to Black Lives Matter. A number of great people have been documenting that. My colleague Mike Gonzalez, Andrew Sullivan, who does such a good job, Andrew McCarthy, Kyle Scheidler have all documented this.
And those names are mentioned in your article.
Yeah, and the links to their articles are in my article.
At The Federalist. You can check it out on our feeds.